to the Justice for Immigrants webinar, Rebuilding the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program in the Next 4 Years. Here we are on the eve of election days, with this, them being a few days away. So this is a very, very timely conversation we'll have today. Next slide, please. We want to welcome everybody. I'm Matt Welch, Refugee Policy Advisor for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I'll be your moderator today. And we want to welcome everybody who's will be viewing this webinar from the Justice for Immigrants Network, from the Refugee Council USA, from Interfaith Immigration Coalition, from the Coalition of State Refugee Resettlement Coordinators, and other guests. And I just want to advise you, as we go along here, we'll have a chat, the ability to have you ask questions in the chat function. So feel free to do that, and we'll monitor it as we go along, and for sure get the questions by the end of the webinar today. Next slide, please. We're very excited about folks we have on the webinar. First of all, we have Charles Shipman, State Refugee Coordinator from the state of Arizona, a post he's held for some 18 years. He's been working for 35 years in resettlement, so we're very excited to see what his thoughts are at this crucial point of rebuilding the resettlement program, because Charles is definitely a leader among leaders at the state level. We're likewise very excited to have Barbara Strack here, former Chief of the Refugee Affairs Division of the Department of Homeland Security. Barbara served for some 12 years in that important post, helping to coordinate the visiting of hundreds of thousands of refugees during that period, which spanned 3 different presidencies of George W. Bush, of President Obama, and President Trump. And Barbara has recently retired, and we're very excited to hear her thoughts and her sharing her experience here today. And third, we have Rachel Pollack, Refugee Resettlement Director here at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And Rachel leads a large and diverse Catholic Charities, local Catholic Charities resettlement service network. And she also has spent years in the field, Catholic Charities in Kansas, a total of 12 years in that, from the local and NGO perspective. Next, please. You'll see very soon from this webinar that it's not going to be like other webinars, and then it'll be more of a conversation, really, about how we rebuild the program, whether it's a second Trump administration or whether it's a new Biden administration, looking at the challenges and then also how to meet those challenges. And we're very aware there's been 4 executive orders and a lot of operational decisions that have led to a 86% reduction in refugee arrivals over the last several years. And we're deep concerned there are many refugees left in harm's way. Families continue to be divided by resettlement, and also communities eager to welcome refugees, like this young girl who's welcoming family at the airport. Next, please. So first, let's look at the challenges. And the way we're going to do this is to spend about 10 minutes on each of these challenges, 10 minutes of conversation. And I'll just briefly go over those so you kind of have a sense of where we're headed in the conversation. First, operating advocacy in an uncertain environment. Second, understanding and responding to global resettlement. Third, securing the important humanitarian, strategic, and economic benefits of resettlement. and then finally building back from the unprecedented low level of admissions. Next, please. So again, this is Matt Wilch, Refugee Policy Advisor for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I'm joined by my colleagues Charles Shipman, who's the Refugee Resettlement State Coordinator for Arizona, Barbara Strack, former Chief of the Refugee Affairs Division of USCIS, and Rachel Pollack, Director of the Resettlement Program. And we're going to focus first on Challenge 1, an uncertain environment. And I wonder, Charles, if you could get us started on this. You know, refugees have been in the spotlight, likely to be in the spotlight in the coming coming years. They already have been the last few years. So I wonder what thoughts you might have about lessons learned during the last 4 or 5 years that you might bring to the future uncertain environment. Charles?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Good morning, or good afternoon maybe for many, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join you today. I want to assure you that no matter what I say today, I am very much an advocate for the U.S. refugee program and for refugee protection. But I am speaking from my particular perspective as a state refugee coordinator, because I think it'll help you to put things in some context. But so Matt, in response to what you said, I'm going to actually talk about it from the past 5 years a little bit, speaking since 2015, where I think particularly we saw the will of President Obama to increase U.S. commitment to refugee protection through resettlement, and then the Paris terrorist attacks that prompted more than 30 states' governors to push back on both increased admissions of refugees and which refugees they felt should be admitted to the U.S. and frankly resettled in their states. And then the skepticism over the U.S. vetting process for refugees and the federal government's consultation process with states around refugee resettlement. So states urged the Department of State and DHHS, so PRM and OR for those of you in refugee resettlement, to fulfill their duties that were promulgated in the Refugee Act of 1980 to engage in close cooperation and advanced consultation, as the Act speaks to, with the relevant state partners. But for many states, that statement was made without there being very much knowledge or understanding about their own state's role in refugee resettlement. And the reality is that the challenging circumstances really highlighted some very important moving parts of an incredible humanitarian program that had really outgrown the conventions within which it was developed. We were then already working in one of the most challenging periods in the history of refugee resettlement, but making decisions about that work based on approaches and resource allocations that to some extent were constrained by the Refugee Act of 1980, and refugee populations and knowledge about effective resettlement and integration practices, which I use the term integration with caution, had evolved a lot over the past 30 plus years. The fallout events from the November 2015 Paris attacks weren't helped by the fact that, and so take this is my experience as having done refugee resettlement as a resettlement agency and as a state coordinator. It wasn't helped by the fact that the U.S. refugee program didn't speak with one voice in both the foreign and domestic aspects of the program, and that concerning the goals of the program itself, the use of the funding for the program, and the intersections with receiving communities about the program. Remember, I'm saying this, I love this program, and it's something I've dedicated pretty much my career and life to. To some extent, I believe that we lost view of the fact that refugee resettlement is the domestic completion of an international commitment to humanitarian protection, to the extent such that the intent to rescue those individuals most at risk of harm, which is a really commendable and admirable thing that our nation has done. And the most vulnerable need then to be aided through a domestic program that has funding and guiding principles to provide adequate support for them, that's independent of the relying on the state benefit systems with the hope that it'll somehow all work out in the end. Though this would not be the way I would have wanted to heighten awareness about refugees' needs and some needed paradigm changes in refugee resettlement, the aftermath of the governor's statements to limit or qualify which refugees should be resettled, it did actually reflect a very fragile commitment of receiving communities to resettlement and integration that couldn't be taken for granted any longer. That is that some parts of the local community see refugees as a caseload of choice, not one of necessity, that should be decreased or eliminated, rather than as a sympathetic population worthy of ongoing support and that's vital to U.S. foreign policy. I would say amazingly, with added clarity, which happens in crises, putting our heads together in some wise and rapid efforts to come together to lend perspective on this, and with voices of resettled refugees and boots on the ground supporters of refugees speaking out in a way as never before, there was some movement of opinion at the state and local levels about who refugees are and what refugee resettlement is all about, really all about. It's been a long and hard 5 years, but I believe we see that if we work together, if we care about common voice and goals, we can make progress. Last year, on September 26, 2019, the President issued his Executive Order 13888 on enhancing state and local involvement in refugee resettlement. And so I say a bit as a footnote, I think something that was not intended necessarily to be advantageous to the refugees and refugee program, that requirement that governors and county CEOs where refugees would be resettled provide written consent permitting that resettlement. Overwhelmingly, states and counties provided that written consent, and in Arizona it was unanimously provided in our counties by the county boards as well as the governor's office. So that would be sort of my initial take on things, Matt.
Very thoughtful, Charles. Thanks very much. Barbara, as you sort of look at that ground, it sounds like a lot of what Charles talked about in the uncertain environment was really continuing to explain the program, explain the deeper parts of the program. What kind of lessons learned do you take from the uncertain time that the program's been through and looking towards an uncertain future?
Thank you very much, Matt. Hi, everyone. This is Barbara Strack. I'm really happy to be joining you today from my home in Washington, D.C. So I think this is a well-labeled slide, right? It's an uncertain environment. I was just looking at the calendar. We're 6 days from Election Day, but then reminding myself this could well be a year where we're not going to know who's won the tally for a little while after that. So obviously it's a dramatically different environment, I think, depending on whether President Trump gets a second term or a Biden administration. And I don't think I'm telling anyone anything they didn't already know, that President Trump is deeply skeptical of not just illegal immigration, undocumented immigration, but also of legal immigration. And this administration has demonstrated that it sees refugees as part and parcel of that. That refugees, there's tremendous skepticism toward refugee resettlement. And we've seen that with the numbers going down. The first year of the Trump administration, 45,000 was the ceiling. It's been a steady decrease, just getting the presidential determination out, I believe, yesterday, at 15,000. And the fact that we waited until October 27th instead of October 1, which is really a statutory requirement, I think puts in context that this administration doesn't put a lot of weight on refugee resettlement. So I think for a Trump administration, the best we can look forward to in operating and advocating is to meet the ceiling. And I think you all know there are some years that the program is very successful and meets the ceiling within literally a few human beings, and other years where it falls very dramatically short. So that would be what I would be looking forward to in a Trump administration, and very much in keeping with what Charles said. I was in government at that time when there was a tremendous skepticism in the program, and I think understanding that people outside of our field don't really know who refugees are is important to keep in mind, and therefore to communicate a lot. And for me, of course, that meant with members of both parties in Congress. I was delighted when we were invited to talk to governors and mayors and law enforcement officials, and my PRM colleagues and I virtually always said yes to that. But one of the things I learned was, don't forget the basics, I guess is what I would say, is when you go in, people need to understand that refugees are legal immigrants who are invited to the country. You can't even apply to the program unless you've essentially been invited to apply. There were members of Congress who had images of the refugees crossing borders in Europe, and it gave them a sense of lawlessness. And so I think it was important to explain the whole, that there is a statutory foundation. And then, where refugees come from, explaining to people whether they're encamped refugees, whether they're Iraqis who worked closely with the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say the fundamentals are important, and don't take anything for granted. Obviously, there'll be a lot more opportunity if it's a Biden administration, but I think I'll save that conversation for a little later on in our conversation.
Okay, very good. Thanks very much, Barbara. I know you've continued that education in retirement, and I heard you testify before the House committee regarding resettlement, which was very, very thoughtful testimony. Rachel, turn to you now on operating and advocating at an NGO level in uncertain times and lessons learned going forward here.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. And I'm also really happy to be joining you all today, working from home in my bedroom here in Washington, D.C. I am, really looking forward to this conversation today. And some thoughts that I've had, while we continue to work to, quote unquote, rebuild the program or meet the current needs given a second Trump administration, we would continue to expect lower refugee arrivals. And given this context, our offices around the U.S., they would continue to focus their efforts on longer-term support for refugee integration, which is something that they've been doing for the past 4 years as they've, gotten really creative to continue to serve clients for a longer period of time as initial resettlement has dwindled. I think one opportunity we recognize is to advocate for an expansion of the current service delivery model for initial refugee support to potentially include asylees or other ORR eligible populations that are not currently included. So for folks who aren't in the resettlement world, right now refugees benefit from a service delivery model that's an initial short-term case management program that helps to put down the building blocks for a new life here in the U.S. and then makes connections to longer-term self-sufficiency supports. It's a program that's called Reception and Placement. And I think one thing we hear a lot from our offices is that there's a really big gap for a lot of people that are other ORR eligible populations that could really benefit from this similar support. So that would be one thing that we could look at as the number of refugees arriving in our communities continues to decline. And then, just regardless of the administration, the church will always reach out to both sides of the aisle to continue to build deeper understanding and foster deeper bipartisan support, especially showing how refugees and other newcomers contribute to their communities in positive ways.
Very good. Thanks very much, Rachel. And as we turn now to the other two items here in this uncertain environment, and one being that we continue to face COVID-19. Number one, on sort of the negative side, but also on the positive side, we're also aware that in these uncertain times, the last few years, we've had some new champions come forward, and we're anticipating that to continue happening. So I wonder if you could each reflect on COVID-19 first, and maybe Barbara, starting with you.
Sure. Well, I do think COVID obviously had a dramatic impact on last year's refugee admissions. To a large extent, the UN Refugee Agency and IOM shut down refugee movements from late March to mid-June. So I think when the opportunity arose in August and September, I actually think that my former colleagues at the State Department, with all the program partners, the RSCs, et cetera, IOM, really did a good job in August and September, despite the very disappointing overall total and falling 6,000 short. But I think that was a real world barrier to the admissions program. Going forward, while refugees can travel now, I think the largest impact is going to be the ability for my former colleagues at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, for the refugee officers to deploy around the world to do new interviews. So there still are a lot of cases of individuals who have already been interviewed and haven't traveled. I think that's the near-term opportunity to figure out what needs to be done to perfect those cases and let people get on airplanes and come to the United States. In the meantime, I think there needs to be some hard thinking, and I believe it's going on, in creative thinking for all the program partners about what can be done remotely. I think we've all been doing that in COVID times to figure out what we really, really need to do in person, face-to-face with a refugee, and what can be done remotely. So I think this is the moment for innovation and creativity.
Very, very good. And something we've all been doing. Here we are all on a webinar together, sort of fighting the COVID fight. So Rachel and Charles, what are your lessons learned from COVID-19 going forward here?
Yeah, I can chime in. As you know, USCCB has a geographic footprint doing resettlement work in many states. And what we've seen is that COVID has impacted the different locations that we work in really different ways. And also throughout the course of pandemic, as things have tightened or loosened based on the reality on the ground. Just for one example, a study released this summer found that nearly half of all of New York City's working class immigrants had lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19. And our offices there experienced that. Many of our programs across the U.S. have reported significant challenges related to available employment, especially in locations like New York City, where refugees have typically found employment in hospitality or restaurants, hotels, airports, that type of work. And then on the other hand, there are many industries that have expanded hiring during the pandemic. So we hear from sites that typically place refugees in warehouse jobs or Amazon or other delivery fulfillment, grocery stores, some healthcare roles, and food production. They have plentiful work opportunities for new arrivals. All of that is tempered with the things that we're all experiencing, navigating virtual schooling, childcare, weighing individual health concerns related to risk, and how comfortable folks feel with pursuing employment, and employment such a critical aspect to the resettlement program. And then I would just also say that resettlement in this environment is really challenging, but it's not impossible. Like Barbara mentioned, it's required a lot of creativity and some pretty big pivots for our offices to provide remote and flexible services. Typically, resettlement services are something that's really hands-on, using interpretation, showing, walking people through things together. So it's been a really heavy lift for folks. We're seeing a lot of front porch case management, digital literacy education, distribution of information resources related to COVID-19, and it's been really challenging, but it's still happening.
Very, very good. Thank you, Rachel. And Charles, what are your thoughts as you've been working in partnership with many of the Catholic charities and other resettlement agencies across the country to help refugees?
Sure. Yeah, I think that in the Refugee Resettlement Program, we should adopt some sort of motto, like theme for My Big Fat Greek Wedding, for those of you who saw it, where Tula talks about when they brought their grandmother over from Greece, and she makes the comment, because we just weren't crazy enough. So it sort of seems like we are in the business of dealing with crises, and you kind of have to accept that that's the reality of what we're doing. We're providing a humanitarian response. So as Barbara and Rachel said, absolutely, it's about innovation. So, you know, when we were talking about this webinar, I mentioned, well, you don't shut life down when there's a crisis, right? The reality is you have to keep going. And in fact, that's something that I think refugees teach us, for those of us who have worked with refugees. But, you know, it was for us, in terms of looking at what was going on, how do we keep delivering to solve problems? Because we kind of are in the problem-solving business, so that they're dealt with, and those that we are serving get what they need. We already know that there's a lot of resiliency. I don't even want to say that in an overused word, but it really is how we manage these moments as a society. Are we learning to be more resilient? Because, you know, we're hearing things like that this isn't the end. There might be another wave coming, and who knows what else is coming in terms of pandemics or things related to that. But at the same time, you know, we're human beings, and we need to be able to be responsive to one another. I think what we've learned, the big lesson that we've learned, is that we're all susceptible. We're all very vulnerable. And I think that's a lesson that's been very important for Americans, because this is part of the education, the heightening of awareness about who refugees are. It doesn't just happen to people who, for some reason, you know, they picked poorly in lots, right? It's the reality that this is something that we're all susceptible to. We're all susceptible to instability in our societies. You know, we pray that it doesn't happen, but the reality is things do happen to people. There are calamities, there are problems. It's not a perfect world. And so, you know, I think the fact that we've learned that, for example, I know here in Arizona, one of the big eye-openers was that our systems, when we had to rely on remote and electronically accessing systems, they didn't work. They didn't work for anybody. It wasn't just refugees. It was many people. We got a lot of feedback from people who even said to us, oh, yeah, now we see what you're saying. When you say that refugees don't have meaningful access, or they can't use systems and things break down, but refugees are often sort of put in that very small category of people who are marginalized by things. But this time it really opened people's eyes to see that anybody can be in those types of predicaments on the turn of a dime. So I think being more open and looking out, being more thoughtful that hardships are not isolated to only certain people in certain situations has been a big moment for us. We, of course, have had to try to address issues of what do you do when you can't do person-facing services in a program that very much depends on that type of intimacy to be true. You know, it's a lot of, with Refugee Resettlement, there is a lot of behavior modification because people have different practices and beliefs, and, you know, social interaction is something that, of course, we encourage and want them to do as part of the comfort of resettling, but then telling people that, you know, they now have to, they can't or pull back, finding PPE for people, and again, you know, having people use it. All of these have been significant challenges, but communication has been much, much better. This has been one of the, our quarterly meetings telephonically are way better attended than they used to be. Ours are public and open to the public, but we've always had pretty good attendance, but they're really well attended now. A lot of things that we've been doing around innovation, talking about a hotline, different resources, web-based, and making them accessible. are kind of the rage now. So, and looking at digital literacy and kids and parents and all of that are really big things now. So I think there is a lot of thinking about, what can we be doing that's safe but innovative, and what were we doing in the past that maybe wasn't so great that we need to fix and do better at. So yeah, I agree with both Barbara and Rachel. You don't, you can't stop the world to get off. You have to keep going, and you have to find ways to figure out problem solvings. And I think that the key is, how do you do it without burning yourself out and others burning themselves out?
Very good, very thoughtful, Charles. Thanks very much. I think just to keep things moving forward, we do have a question in the chat box, but I think if you don't mind, we'll hold those couple questions until we get a little farther through the presentation to make sure that we get it all out before taking those questions. So let's turn, Tony, to the understanding resettlement need. So we've been talking about the uncertain environment, but also there's understanding or knowing what the numbers are, what the resettlement need is. We're aware, for example, there's 79.5 million forcibly displaced people, 26 million of them refugees, over 1.4 million refugees needing resettlement. We know that the typical average annual refugee goal in the U.S. has been 95,000 refugees over the 40-year of the program. But we're also aware that, as Barbara mentioned, just this morning, there was an announcement of the presidential determination for President Trump being official at 15,000 people, where we've heard a response from Mr. Biden that he pledges to bring 125,000 refugees in the near future. So those are the numbers. And Tony, I'd ask you to go to the next slide to look at thinking behind the numbers. So let's start with you, Barbara, in understanding the need and response at the federal policy operational level. We see this global need, but then we've seen the resettlement, actual resettlement from the administration being much lower. And I know they've talked about a couple of things, couple of reasons that they give for that. One has to do with the number of asylum seekers, and the second with overseas assistance. And I wonder if you could unpack that for us and respond to sort of the current challenge, the current rationale of the administration for low numbers.
Thanks, Matt. I would be happy to. I mean, I think the lesson from the numbers and the previous slide that you showed is that this administration's policymaking is not driven by the numbers. It's driven by a pre-existing hostility to immigrants and refugees. I think that's the only way to understand the numbers at a big level. But you have flagged the two things that I'd say probably get under my skin the most. I think they're dangerous in that each of them has like this tiny nugget of truth, and then it's spun into misdirection. So let me start first with refugee and asylum. It's not either or is the basic premise. Since the Refugee Act began for the last 40 years, we have had both refugee and asylum. They are both humanitarian programs, but it's not a zero-sum game. We can do both. The nugget of truth is at an operational level for USCIS. The two programs do sometimes lend staff back and forth to each other because it's a highly trained, a highly skilled job category. So the easiest way to lend staff back and forth is between those two programs. But that's a management issue at the agency level. When I was there, I know people are there to deal with it today. They can figure that out. So that's not a reason not to have a robust refugee program. The second one also gets under my skin, and it's this notion that we don't really need resettlement because we're assisting refugees overseas with U.S. dollars, funding agencies, funding NGOs, and the administration argues that's really better to help people close to home where they are. Well, again, it is good to help people and to have robust overseas assistance. But what that misses is that resettlement was always, resettlement is always the exceptional solution for the most vulnerable refugees. And order of magnitude, traditionally, over time, it's been about 1% of all the refugees in the world get resettled. Traditionally, the U.S. took 0.5%, the rest of the world combined took the other 0.5%. So, yes, assistance is the right answer closer to home for 99% of refugees or thereabouts. But what settlement does is help the people who aren't safe where they are. They're not safe in that country of asylum, in their host country, or they're in an intractable situation, and we know that the likelihood that they're going to be able to go home or live an integrated, locally integrated life in their host country isn't going to be successful. So resettlement is about the most vulnerable refugees, about the long stayers, about the people for whom just assistance in place in their country that they fled to is not an adequate humanitarian response.
Oh, super, super helpful, Barbara. Thanks so much. And that's looking at those sort of national issues. Now, Charles, when you're faced with going back and forth with your governor or with your community leaders in Arizona, what's sort of behind the numbers that get recommended in the state plan of Arizona that goes to the Office of Refugee Resettlement?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Sorry, I would probably echo what Barbara said. Right now, I don't think it's much about the numbers. Obviously, arrivals have been so low. So in terms of what people see now, that's low. Going up, I don't think that there would be a lot of concern around it per se. But I know that, I think to Barbara's point, deception is something that you really have to pay close attention to, because she's right. It takes bits of truth, right, and then it sort of it spins things in a particular way. So it's really important from our perspective to be present, to be part of ongoing conversations. You can't let it stop because it's very easy to think that things somehow are going to drive themselves, but things don't usually work that way because it's so easy for things to get derailed. So we stay very present in conversations, obviously with federal agencies, and for pragmatic reasons as well. The Social Security Administration, because there are issues with that because of COVID-related things with USCIS, with even the FBI, the Census Bureau, regional offices with DHHS, for example. But we have a good relationship. We've maintained a good relationship with the governor's office. Much of that has to do with we're very transparent. We're available. We've learned to listen very closely, and we've learned to provide factual information where we can with our state legislature where possible, and that's not always going to happen a lot. But on the occasions, again, to be well prepared and to be able to inform people, because, again, that's an area where things can really get taken out of context. But also even with our own departments, leadership, and sister state government entities. For us, that would be our Medicaid agency, Department of Health, Department of Child Safety, our benefits issuing divisions and employment divisions, disability divisions, community action programs, aging and adult protection programs, domestic violence, lots, because there are a lot of things that touch refugees' lives or refugees can come into contact with. And so for us, it's really important to keep people engaged. We also have to think about that from the context of municipal government, so mayor's offices of our metropolitan areas where refugees are resettling and their administrations, school districts and schools, law enforcement departments, public health at the county level, housing. And then we really made it our work as well to work with legacy organizations that are working with marginalized communities. So for us, that would be organizations like Chicanos por la Causa and Friendly House and FIBCO, which is First Institutional Baptist Church here in downtown Phoenix. But we've also done a ton of work very intentionally, and this goes back to my years of working in resettlement directly with faith organizations. We've been also doing more work than we did in the past with ECBOs, ethnic community-based organizations. And then a lot of groups that have come alongside refugees specifically, like Welcome to America and Lifting Hands. The universities have particularly gotten involved. We Are All America and others. But we're also trying to make sure that our quarterly meetings are very meaningful and they touch on things that are informative and helpful. And again, we use that to try to clarify things, to help people be well-grounded, as well as other meetings we have. And we've not had lots of conferences like we used to, but we've had some targeted symposiums. We have some targeted working groups. We're also, our state does, it's called the Arizona Management System. It's a lean management system, which, people have their opinions about. Some of the things it's helped us with is having problem-solving tools, which we don't just use internally, but we use with our stakeholders and partners. We're also undertaking a collective impact effort using within an equity and inclusion framework. So collective impact is the commitment of a group of actors or what we call preferred partners to form cohorts from different sectors towards a common agenda for solving specific social problems using a structured form of collaboration, and that is actually technically the definition. But we decided that we often try to solve problems, but we're in the stratosphere rather than getting to the root causes. And so I think to Barbara's point, again, it's a lot about, are we really tackling where the problem lies? And this has become really important for us, not to waste our time sort of, circulating and spinning where people are just going to keep, arguing with you. It's getting down to the facts, getting down to where does the problem really exist. And so we have a great cohort that's formed. This has become very popular in refugee resettlement, and it's very, we have right now 11 different organizations part of a first cohort, and they're pretty broadly represented in terms of where they're coming from. It's not just the resettlement agencies and ethnic community based organizations, but from other sectors as well. So we've been really intentional about strategy. It's something that I learned again long ago in resettlement when you get into political binds, because the truth is it does get political. In my role, we can't always be political, but we can search for truth and fact, and we can work towards problem solving. And so that's something we no matter what, where things end up at the end of the day in terms of who's in power and who's deciding what, we're still going to have things that we have to figure out. And so for us, it's become key to go to the people that we live with every single day, the people that we're rubbing elbows with, regardless of where they may stand, and continue to plug away at what our message is and what our goal is and what we think it should be. And so we're working on TANF issues, and we're looking at public-private partnership. We have RiskNet, which is a website, a statewide website that we developed in concert with the communities of resettlement here, which is a great resource. I recommend people look at it. We have developed in both of our resettlement areas citywide Refugee 101, so we talk from the same page. We've had stakeholder meetings, very intentional to kind of bring people out. We don't want people in the shadows. we have a statewide VISTA refugee resettlement project, which has been amazing. As I mentioned earlier, we're working on a hotline, a resource for refugees and others to call into. That we're about halfway, I'd say, into that. But I am very convinced that no matter what happens, the solutions rest in our communities here on the ground. We have to bring our community alongside this. I think that's what's kept a lot of it afloat, even in these really tough, difficult times, is what communities have seen and what they've learned. It's important for them to know the truth and for them to get good information, for them to be able to make decisions and then act on them based on their convictions. So I would spend a lot of my energy and time on working on my neighbors here.
Oh, wow. What a great kind of blueprint you've laid out. And I think the kind of success that you've had over the years in Arizona is telling that your approach has had a lot of success. So thanks very much for sharing that. Now we turn to you, Rachel, and sort of behind the numbers, understanding it sort of from a Catholic social teaching perspective. Rachel?
Sure, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I would just echo, from the Catholic social teaching point of view, welcoming refugees is really a calling, and Jesus called us to do that in Matthew 25, saying, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And when we look through the Old Testament, it's a story of refugee people. Jesus himself had to flee as an infant with his family to avoid persecution or death. And so this motivates our network and our parishes to do this work. And just kind of echoing what others have said, as attention has been brought to this work through the Trump administration over the last several years, I think what we've seen is just a broadening of champions, faith collaborators, other people of goodwill. We've seen an expansion of parish and community partnerships. And just to note, one of the challenges we regularly hear from our offices, or at least we did pre-COVID, was that there's just such a great interest in volunteer engagement and community support that's been really challenging to meet with lower arrivals. We've had strong partnerships develop with the Mormon community, corporations, and just individuals and other community groups. So I think, what I hear is just that there's a lot of will and capacity to do this work together, and it's kind of our role is harnessing that and resourcing it, and finding a way to carry it forward, because the will and the desire to do this work is there. Thanks
very much, Rachel. So there's a lot of hope, even though these have been difficult times. Hope in future. Next slide, please, Tony. As we look at the challenges, the need, that's the challenges in the environment, the needs that are there. The other side of the equation really is that we're not only meeting needs of refugees, but we're also securing U.S. interests. And I wonder, Barbara, if you might start us off here to understand the securing of those interests, and especially to look at what your experience has been with being one of the humanitarian leaders and part of U.S. humanitarian leadership to meet humanitarian and foreign policy and other goals as well. Barbara?
Thanks so much. So in my former job, I did have the chance to travel quite a bit internationally. So I went to capitals around the world where refugees were, I met government officials of countries hosting refugees, met lots of times with UN colleagues, and usually accompanied with State Department folks. So I guess there's two dimensions of this for me. One is that when the United States leads on humanitarian issues, it raises the game for everybody. It creates more protection space, as the UN Refugee Agency likes to say. So by that, what I mean is when the United States engages with a particular refugee population and that kind of responsibility sharing with a host government, which is always under pressure, it helps create other protection even for the refugees who aren't actually themselves being resettled. So it gives the United States diplomats the opportunity for dialogue about, hey, why don't you keep your borders open because people are still at risk and people still need to flee. Maybe let the refugee children attend your public schools. Iraqi kids got to go to public schools in Jordan. It can be a whole range of different issues, labor rights, mobility rights, even a re-registration so that refugees have an identity document. Just the ability to navigate the world when you don't have an identity document is hard, and it can have less harassment from police if you just have that document to show you're a registered refugee. So that's kind of the humanitarian dimension. It also helps bring other resettlement countries to the world. So very often when the United States got involved with a particular population, the other traditional resettlement countries, whether it was Canada, Australia, the Nordics, and some of the unusual resettlement countries, would sometimes get involved as well. So there's real humanitarian leadership really matters, and it's something that this administration has entirely not just abandoned, but I think it's set a bad example. So we're an example of what not to do in various ways. The other thing, though, I would say, again, because I used to work at the Department of Homeland Security, which is obviously not known for its prioritizing humanitarian issues across the board, resettlement is also important because when we engage with those governments, we don't have to limit the engagements to humanitarian issues. We can talk to them about other interests of foreign policy, other interests of national security. So, refugees come from conflict zones. They come from volatile regions in the world, and they're places where the United States has multifaceted interests. And by helping host governments, by engaging with them to help them solve what they may see as a problem of refugees in their country, it opens up the opportunity for those conversations. And as Matt mentioned at the beginning, I worked across as a career government official across 3 administrations. And so it's notable to me, both secretaries of Homeland Security from both Democratic and Republican administrations, Michael Chertoff and Jay Johnson, were both big supporters of the refugee program. And they both traveled in the world and went and visited refugees and resettlement support centers, and it really made a difference, I think, in their understanding and their support of the program. So let me pause there and let you move on to the next the next speaker.
Sure. Thanks very much, Barbara. And Charles, I wonder if you could pick up at the state level kind of the U.S. humanitarian economic interests that that are being pursued in the resettlement program.
Sure. I always love listening to Barbara. I definitely understand that this is there's more to this than just being a humanitarian program. We know very much about what refugees bring, but I guess what I'm going to say is it's what I've learned over the years, and obviously this has a lot to do with the domestic stuff, and some of it might seem counterintuitive because of the moment that we're in and because of the environment that we're in terms of our current presidency, but I guess I would say that, to be just very honest in terms of how can we help improve things regardless of who might be the next president, I think we have to recognize that the fragile commitment of receiving communities to resettlement and integration just can't be taken for granted. It's just not tenable, it's not productive for us to do stealth resettlement, and I know I say that in a time when resources are extremely tough and resettlement agencies have been, diminished, and that my heart aches for that. But it is something that certainly has not helped us in terms of getting to where we are today. We have a very short engagement with refugees. and the receiving communities after they arrive. We just can't expect the gaps in federal refugee resettlement support to shift the state and local communities per se. I think that there's sort of this unspoken thing that happens where a lot of that does occur. The inherent willingness of the American public to welcome refugees and to help them transition to life. People fleeing harm have to be met with extended engagement. It's just a reality. So how are we going to do that? I think the absence of extended engagement has produced really unacceptable results. We don't want to resettle refugees as new, impoverished, and underemployed families with limited options for improvement that then regret or resent their resettlement in the U.S. We don't want local communities to view refugees as a caseload of choice rather than necessity that should be decreased or eliminated, rather than as a sympathetic population that's worthy of ongoing support and that's really vital to the U.S. Foreign policy and to our economy. So the transitional life for refugees in the U.S., I see, and I think many of us know this, it's a two-way street of engagement and adaptation between the refugees as they arrive and the communities that are receiving them. And the less the federal government can afford to fund and sustain on its own all the needs of refugees, the more that's going to fall on state and local stakeholders in both public and private sectors to help those refugees. We can't, I think, expect to motivate the creation of state and local partnerships along all of the pathways that contribute to refugees achieving successful resettlement integration, which, by the way, we don't even define what successful resettlement is as a country. We can't do that by merely reminding states and local partners that refugees have a statutory eligibility for assistance and services, and I've been guilty of that as well. Especially at a time of what I would say are profound federal, state, and local constrictions on funding, the gap is increasingly large between the levels of assistance provided because of mandatory eligibility and the need for access to broader and a lot more specialized services that's denied, often because of funding cuts or limitations. And it's precisely at a time like that that state and local partnerships need to be enhanced. So we need local communities to be champions for refugees and refugee resettlement, but we need to be honest about who refugees are. We need to be honest about why we're so committed to their protection, what they need, what our limits are, and what we can do to meet those needs with what we've got, regardless of inadequate support, and I would say from the government. The bottom line, I think, is what is refugee resettlement success? What are its indicators? What should we be doing, and what are we actually doing? And then what paradigm can we plan around and implement that marries traditional resettlement actors and local communities in very substantive and sustainable ways that meet refugees' real needs towards a definition of success? The fragile commitment that I spoke of receiving communities to resettlement and integration is really, I think, a key issue. But I think it's really important that we build those relationships with local communities. We need to have that extended engagement. We need for people to understand how refugee resettlement works. But one thing I want to say is, in refugee resettlement, I think we've been very good about asking for help, but terrible about receiving it. We don't do a very good job about helping people to become our helpers, because we get frustrated. Again, I speak from experience, hard lessons that I had to learn and be cured from. But we get frustrated because we depend on our systems of efficiency and quickness, and we know what we're going to do, and people are getting in our ways, and we're getting derailed, or this rogue person. We have to figure out how to get people to be in communities in a place where they actually can help. Because that does two things. One, it's an investment towards having greater support in material ways, in emotional ways, but also in terms of having political support.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Charles. And as we turn to Rachel here, I'm just wanting to double check with Tony, but I'm I'm quite sure we can add an additional 15 minutes to our presentation here in order to be able to get to a number of questions. Tony, can you just let me know in the chat box whether that would be okay to do?
Hi, Matt. Hi, Matt. I don't know if you can hear me, but it would be up to your presenters. We can go as long as they're able to stay on.
Okay, and so with Charles and Barbara, would you be up for another 15 minutes here?
I'm fine.
Yes, happy to.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, Tony, and thanks a lot, Barbara and Charles. And I'm assuming, Rachel, that you'd be able to hang in us in here with us as well. Sure.
Yeah, fine by me. Matt.
Well, and on this, I wonder if I think you've touched on quite a few of those U.S. values already when you responded about the Catholic social teaching. So I think maybe, Tony, let's turn to challenge 4 that we have. And of course, this is sort of the most visible challenge, and that is that the program has just decreased by about 86% in the last 4 years. So what can we do on the federal level, the state level, and community level to rebuild the program? And I noticed that quite a few of the questions that we've had in the chat box have to do with these questions. So Barbara, I wonder if we could start with you again, please.
Sure. This is a really big challenge, obviously. I mean, I would say, again, for the Trump administration, I think the scope of advocacy is constrained by the ceiling, but I would try to advocate towards meeting the ceiling. I would say also that this year's presidential determination, like last year's, is a very, very odd thing. And I think it's important to understand, although it purports to favor those refugees who are fleeing religious persecution versus other categories. Folks on this call may know you can be fleeing political persecution or racial or ethnic persecution, or there's lots of different categories. While the Trump administration purports to favor those refugees facing religious persecution, in fact, it's really a limit. It is a small number of cases, and under the traditional system, it was really open-ended. So the numbers were bigger and they were open-ended. So I would say don't be fooled that this purporting to favor religious based refugees is a good thing. It's a limit. I think it's also important to call out the fact that it is de facto under the Trump administration continuing the bias against Muslims that is baked in to this presidential determination by the numbers and also by the countries it excludes. So it particularly calls out. I want to refresh my memory, make sure it's Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. And I think that's the only real way we can understand that. I'm sorry, I'm refreshing my. The other thing I guess I would say is if there is a Biden administration, in contrast, as I understand, there's a commitment to raise the ceiling to 125,000. Frankly, as a former government manager in an operational job, that's going to be hard to do in 1 year. To go from such a low number to much higher, because it takes money for the system, for the federal agencies, for the state, for UNHCR to rebuild the referral mechanism. So it's going to be hard to go that far that fast. Nonetheless, I think it is important because by having that sort of stake in the ground in terms of policy, it lets all the players understand what the direction is going forward and can start building towards that, whether that means money and hiring or the kinds of things Charles is talking about, that it means communication, coalition building, and lots and lots of coordination.
Thanks very much, Barbara. And I noted that as you were giving your very thoughtful answer, you answered some of the questions that popped up. For example, that Joyce had asked, that whether whether President Trump's policies had been negatively impacting people of color. So I think you mentioning that and also of people of Muslim faith. I noticed you also were responding. Well, one thing, actually, a question, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that. We have here in the chat box that might be part of the federal response of building back, has to do with what specific parts of the kind of the overseas infrastructure, if any, need some rebuilding in order to respond and get the program back to a better levels.
Yeah, I have been retired for 2 years, so I don't have the granular level that expertise that I suspect the government folks are already starting to plan towards. I think one of the issues is that the infrastructure, well, I guess I would divide it into two pieces. There are the cases that are already in the U.S. program, who've been identified to the U.S. program for resettlement, and they are at kind of every stage of the process, from not having had an intake interview yet to having been ready to get on an airplane when the Muslim ban happened, almost 4 years ago, and had a cascading problem since then in terms of getting their security clearances redone and things like that. So I think there needs to be, the government folks need to put their heads together and look at that pipeline and figure out how to perfect those cases and let those people travel. But the other part of it that I think has been kind of broken is how do new cases come into the system. And traditionally, the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, was the main driver identifying those cases that are in need of resettlement to the U.S. according to standards that the U.S. and UNHCR agreed upon. Also, if you all know, the U.S. has the capacity to identify group resettlements, priority twos, and those are kind of more administratively efficient and can yield larger admission numbers. So I think the government would need to get back and change the signal to UNHCR and say, hey, the United States is open for business in terms of humanitarian business. And but those are literally people. They're jobs that the U.S. generally funds, and so they need to figure out how to get that ask UNHCR to and support UNHCR in doing that refugee identification. And also, I think hard about what are some priority two groups, individuals who are very vulnerable, who would be suitable candidates for resettlement to the U.S. So those would be the top priorities.
Oh, very good. Thanks very much. And Charles, what thoughts do you have at the state level, and Rachel, you at the community level and the NGO level about rebuilding, either in a Trump or in a Biden administration?
Sure. Again, I think from a domestic side, we don't do ourselves any favor by not identifying what success is for refugees in resettlement. I don't know that will happen with the federal government. It's something that's been brought to them and discussed by states, certainly. I do think it's something that states with resettlement agencies and others could talk about. It would be great to land on some indicators in that regard. But from a livable economic consideration or conditions to well-being, what quality of life is the target in terms of refugees' health and safety and their sense of belonging, their ability to engage, their educational and social adaptation needs regardless of their gender or age or other characteristics. I think we have to ask ourselves, how are our public systems of support meeting refugees' needs or not? Are they meaningfully accessible, and are they responsive culturally to the needs at hand? And And if they aren't, how are those gaps being addressed? Are they gaps for refugees, or are they or do they reflect gaps for everybody? Are we thinking about refugees' strengths? Are we thinking about their accomplishments? I think we often underplay what refugees have actually accomplished. We set these goals supposedly or ostensibly with them, but we forget what refugees have been through and what the hurdles are in terms of reality, and that they've already accomplished amazing things. So are we setting realistic goals for them? And I know this is a hard conversation to have in the current presidency because there's little look at the humanitarian side of things, but have we set realistic goals? Are we undervaluing refugees' achievements? So do we have a plan for engaging refugees that meet those needs, or do we end help based on preset timeline? And I think I know what the answer to that is a lot of times. And we have a very front-loaded refugee service system, which can be fine for some people, but doesn't work for a number of refugees, considering we've traditionally resettled some of the most vulnerable refugees in the world. Again, regardless of whether it's realistic for refugees, are we just stopping services? And then I think the question is, are we advocating for improved systems? I know that can be hard when there can be pushback against what we do, but with whom are we advocating and how are we advocating? We have to ask ourselves that a lot. What are we actually doing? And it's unlikely that I think that systems are only presenting gaps for refugees. And again, I think we learned that from COVID, that a lot of the things that we encounter aren't just refugee barriers, they're barriers to many people in the community. So then I would just say, finally, how are we appealing to and engaging the community? I sound like a broken record, but honestly, I think when you hit these tough political moments, that's one of the places where you can try to make some headway, particularly in the faith communities. What do they bring to bear? Are we welcoming to them? And it goes back to what I said, we ask for help, but I just feel like we kind of ask for help with our arms pushed out, do what I need you to do, but I don't want to think about what you need. Or do we ask for help, but then our behaviors and existing systems push them away because they get in the way we think, or they don't understand our work. They don't get it, as we used to say. Are we investing in them by engaging them, explaining to them who we are, what and the why and how we do things? Are we being honest and vulnerable? It's one of the things I tell our resettlement agencies: be honest with people, be vulnerable, tell people you stepped up to the plate. It's a tough thing. You need help. Don't make excuses because you don't have enough money or resources. Tell people. Telling them that, and that what we believe we should be doing, not what we can do because of what we got, what we think we should be doing for refugees. So are we seeking captains among them to lead efforts in the community so that we don't have to be the enforcers? Let other people be the enforcers. Get captains to bring along coalitions, like Barbara referred to when I made my comment. Get coalitions and get other people to be the captains of them. Let them get to know you, the good, the bad, the ugly, and get their devotion to you so they can do the hard work of getting people in keep them in line and to do the things that you really need people to help with. Not, we need some diapers or bed sheets, whatever. You do need those, but you need a lot more things. So seeking captains among the communities, I would say faith communities in particular, are great to lead efforts in the community that match our missions, that really match our missions.
Absolutely. Well, very, very good, and a great vision, I think, too. And for us, Rachel, as part of a faith-based organization, I know that's something that you often work at as well, to try to build those kind of champions within the Catholic Church and with other faith groups as well, and coalitions. So I wonder, Rachel, if you could talk a bit about at the community and NGO level. And as you talk, I notice the questions here. There's some questions about what is it of the kind of NGO infrastructure that has been reduced during the reduction in refugee arrivals, and what are some strategies for sort of rebuilding that so that refugees can be, as Charles said very eloquently and in different ways, numerous ways, in order that refugees can be welcomed very well and receive that sort of good quality of life that everybody is working for.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You know, the Trump administration has been focused on resettlement for individuals fleeing religious persecution. And we would expect this to continue under a second Trump administration, likely with low numbers, even possibly lower numbers than we've seen in the past few years. So you know, that's going to be a big challenge. There may be some opportunity in pursuing a non-traditional type of resettlement, something outside of the traditional framework, more along the community sponsorship model, which requires either a guarantee of funding and support be raised from a community group. We've seen this done with some success in both the UK and Canada. And you know, it kind of speaks a little bit to what Charles has said. I think that for most of our offices that are currently doing resettlement work, this feels really challenging, this type of arrangement, just because of kind of the hyper-professionalization and the compliance focus of the current resettlement program. It just feels really vulnerable and challenging to turn over some of the critical functions over to volunteers. But I think this could be an opportunity. It could be a way of growing our, you know, making our buy-in less fragile. I think I like how Charles has kind of framed that. Maybe makes our local buy-in a little more robust as people strengthen and deepen their relationship with refugees and their understanding of the program. And we think maybe that's something the administration could support, because it would put more of the ownership, both financially and just in general, it puts more of the ownership in the local community, which has been something that we've seen. There are pitfalls there that would need to be addressed for sure, but it's just, you know, something that I'm interested in at least thinking about learning more about. And I'm also hopeful that some of the Republican governors could help the president realize how refugees do play a really critical role in economic development in their state. So you mentioned that I come from Kansas, and many of the refugees there work in meatpacking or other critical roles in the state. And we've had really robust support from various chambers of commerce throughout the state, because they see firsthand, you know, the impact on their local communities, and they see the challenges too. But we see this same type of support in other Midwestern states and in some more of the rural red states. So there might be opportunity to kind of, you know, galvanize and empower that support a little bit more. And then under a Biden administration, yeah, we have a lot of work to do. We would need to build back and strengthen. We have many local partners that we're still working with who have programs that are really small at this point, and they would need time and resources to, you know, build up their infrastructure to support arrivals, but also to do that really critical community development, community coalition building work that we have been talking about today that's so critical. And then we have a lot of partners who have had to leave the program due to low arrivals and just arrivals being at a really unsustainable level for them. And for those organizations to make the kind of commitment to rejoin the program, I think they would have to have some confidence that the program would be sustainably growing back. They would have financial and political support to do the work. So yeah, I think there's also an opportunity here as we rebuild the program, potentially under a Biden administration, to take a relook at the objectives and the indicators for success under the program, and just kind of reimagine how this can be done better. And then I would just say, you know, I recognize under a Biden administration the need to grow programmatic capacity and this deep political and community will concurrently, and those things can't be done without one another, and they have to happen kind of in lockstep to really have this program be successful.
Thanks very much. Very, very thoughtful, Rachel. There's one question in the box here that I see, or part of the question from Caleb, I think, is that the administration, or maybe somewhat earlier, where there's a question about what if there continues to be a Republican majority in the Senate, and what impact will that have on the refugee program? And just one observation that I would make is, I think if you're talking about the kinds of, further strengthening of the program that Charles was talking about, where you might be, seeking to, and also that Rachel talked about, where you're talking about, committing to a longer frame of support for refugees to really maximize that success. I think those kinds of things would be very difficult probably to get through with if there's a majority in the Senate of Republican, similar to the current majority. I think, though, one thing that we did see, though, was really among appropriators, continued bipartisan support for the refugee program. And because it's a program where the administration has so much discretion, even though the appropriators were behind the program, the administrators of the program at the political level weren't allowing, that full commitment of Congress to be demonstrated within the program itself. So that's just a thought on that. And I'm mindful that we're over time here, but I really appreciate everybody continuing to join. And I might offer a couple of minutes to each of the speakers if you have any closing thoughts for us, please. And Charles, if you could begin, please.
Sure. I guess a closing thought would be, one, to say thank you to everybody who's hung in there with refugee resettlement and supporting refugees through what I know have been some really, really challenging past few years. I think as much as anything, that's been a demonstration of how committed we are to this important humanitarian program. But just also, I would say, continue to hang in there. I know this has been one of the most tumultuous times that we've been through. I've been around long enough to have seen some of those times where we've had dips and valleys. But I do have faith. I actually literally have spiritual faith as well. I happen to be somebody who believes in what Psalm 119:71 says, that affliction is actually good for us because it teaches us to rely on things that aren't just of this world. And I think that refugees need that type of belief, faith, commitment. Men are men, and they are what they are. And sometimes we have to hope for, pray for better things. And so that's certainly something that I do and will do. But yes, I think just to continue to be wise about what we're doing and messaging. I think the instinct, or I don't know if maybe it's not an instinct, maybe the proclivity would be to grow weary and tired and give up. But I remember who we're doing this for. And I remember that people have endured horrible things for very, very long periods of time, much worse than what we're going through. And things might get worse for us as a nation. We don't know, but that's not what we do. We don't give up and we don't stop because of that. So I just encourage you to hang in there and know that even from our level, for many of us in states, that we are your friends, we're allies, we're partners, we're colleagues, we care about refugees, we care about you. I think it's just really important that we continue to find ways to share our common values so that we can come to common approaches and common advocacy and find solutions through what sometimes seems like untenable or situations that, but to which there's no solution for. I don't believe that, and I won't believe it. So just thank you, and hang in there. And I just think it's really important that we stick this out and continue to be really thoughtful about steps forward, regardless of who's president, but not to give up.
Thanks very much, Charles. Barbara?
I was really struck with Rachel's last comment, and I think she hit the nail on the head, saying that we need to work in lockstep on these operational issues, but at the same time be advocates and be working in communities and be collaborative and building this community further. Even though I feel like in some ways I've been a voice of gloom on this call, in some ways, the bipartisanship is a place where I wouldn't throw in the towel yet. I mean, I've been with the program long enough. When early in my career, Ted Kennedy, who's about as liberal a Democrat as you could find, and Sam Brownback, a super conservative Republican, were both on the Judiciary Committee, and they were both big advocates for the refugee program. And while that bipartisanship has certainly fallen apart, I wouldn't throw in the towel on the ability to recreate that kind of a coalition around refugee issues, just for the kinds of reasons that Charles was talking about. And I think in some ways a little glimmer of hope is around one of President Trump's executive orders, the one where he basically was inviting governors and local governments to veto having refugees placed in their states. And very overwhelmingly, the governors said they wanted refugees, and that included a lot of Republican governors. I was involved in one of those conversations. I was invited to join mainly local folks in Nebraska, which, again, is quite a conservative Republican governor, but because the local community did their work, and it was the faith community, and it was employers, and a whole coalition in that community educated the governor, and he came down saying refugees could still be resettled in his state. So I wouldn't throw in the towel on that. That's an avenue for hope, I think, regardless of whether it's a Trump or a Biden administration.
Very, very good. Thanks very much, Barbara. Rachel?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to both Charles and Barbara. I've been really inspired. I feel like in these days we have to take the good when we get it and to really celebrate it. So it's felt really nice to be a part of this conversation with you all today. One thing that I thought I might say as we kind of close today, I started working with refugees as a volunteer in 2005, and one of my volunteer duties was to take a little girl who had just arrived in the United States to go get enrolled in school, and then to help her get on the bus for her very first day of school. And she seemed so small at the time, and I was so worried, but she was really brave and just got right on that bus, went to school, and recently she just graduated from high school as the valedictorian of her class, and is currently in university studying to be a pharmacist. So I think Charles was talking about being in this work long enough to go through a lot of the ups and downs. One of the things I have loved is just being in this work long enough to know people who have just come a long way and are really contributing to their local communities, and being able to share stories like that. It feels like we're going to make it, and this thing's going to continue to move forward and help individuals and also help our communities. So we'll end with that.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And Charles Shipman, State Refugee Coordinator, State of Arizona, to Barbara Strack, former Chief Refugee Affairs Division, of the Department of Homeland Security, to Rachel Pollack, Refugee Resettlement Director of USCCB MRS. Thanks very much. You really helped share with us a vision of perseverance and hope. Thanks very much. And thanks to all of you who are joined us to listen in this presentation. We wish you all well. And as Charles said, keep up the good fight.